The morning mist clung to the Maryland countryside like a shroud of destiny. As Private Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Infantry Regiment bent down to retrieve what appeared to be discarded cigars wrapped in paper, it was September 13th, 1862, and this seemingly insignificant moment would alter the trajectory of the American Civil War. Forever. As Mitchell unwrapped the tobacco, his eyes widened in disbelief. Before him lay not ordinary wrapping paper, but detailed military orders bearing the signature of Robert Edward Lee himself. The document, later known as Special Order 191, contained the complete battle plans for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia as it advanced into Maryland. During the first Confederate invasion of Union territory, General George Brinton McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac, could scarcely believe his fortune when the captured orders reached his headquarters. For the first time in the war, he possessed intimate knowledge of his opponent's intentions. Lee had divided his army into multiple columns, sending Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry while the remaining forces moved toward Hagerstown. It was a bold but risky strategy that left the Confederate Army vulnerable, if Union forces could move swiftly enough. According to historical accounts documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, McClellan reportedly exclaimed to his staff, "Here's a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." The normally cautious general finally had the advantage he needed to crush Lee's army piece by piece. However, McClellan's characteristic hesitation would prove costly. Despite possessing Lee's complete battle plan, he moved with his typical deliberate pace, allowing precious hours to slip away. Lee, unaware that his orders had been compromised, continued executing his risky division of forces. Meanwhile, Jackson's men were already engaged in the siege of Harper's Ferry, where Colonel Dixon Stansbury Miles commanded the Union garrison. The stage was set for what would become the bloodiest single day in American military history. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, approximately 55,000 strong, found itself scattered across western Maryland, while McClellan's Army of the Potomac, numbering nearly 87,000 men, slowly converged on their positions. As September 14th dawned, the first clashes erupted at South Mountain, where Confederate forces under Daniel Harvey Hill desperately tried to hold the mountain passes at Turner's Gap and Crampton's Gap. These preliminary engagements would serve as the opening notes of a symphony of destruction that would crescendo 3 days later along the banks of Antietam Creek. The small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, nestled between the Potomac River and Antietam Creek, would soon become the focal point of a battle that would determine not only the fate of Lee's invasion, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. European powers watched closely, waiting to see if the Confederacy could achieve a decisive victory on Union soil that might justify diplomatic recognition and intervention. Neither army fully comprehended the magnitude of what was about to unfold, but the discovery of those lost orders had set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of American history. By September 15th, 1862, Robert Edward Lee faced a commander's worst nightmare. His divided army was scattered across Maryland, with Stonewall Jackson still engaged at Harper's Ferry and the rest of his forces struggling to maintain cohesion after the brutal fighting at South Mountain. Intelligence reports indicated that McClellan's massive Army of the Potomac was advancing faster than anticipated, threatening to destroy the Confederate forces piecemeal. Lee made a fateful decision that would define his legacy as a military tactician. Rather than retreating immediately across the Potomac River to safety, he chose to concentrate his available forces at Sharpsburg, a small Maryland town positioned on high ground overlooking Antietam Creek. This defensive position offered several advantages. The Potomac River protected his left flank, the terrain provided natural defensive positions, and it allowed him to maintain his invasion of Union territory while awaiting Jackson's return from Harper's Ferry. The Army of Northern Virginia began taking positions along a 4-mile line stretching from the Dunker Church in the north to Antietam Creek in the south. James Longstreet's 1st Corps anchored the center and right of the line, while Daniel Harvey Hill's division held the crucial center positions around the Dunker Church. and the Hagerstown Pike, the Confederate line was dangerously thin, with fewer than 18,000 men initially available to face McClellan's approaching host. Meanwhile, George Brinton McClellan's Army of the Potomac methodically approached Sharpsburg. Throughout September 15th and 16th, the Union commander deployed his forces with characteristic caution, establishing headquarters at the Philip Pry House, which provided an excellent view of the Confederate positions across Antietam Creek. From this vantage point, McClellan and his staff could observe Lee's defensive preparations while finalizing their own battle plans. The Union deployment reflected McClellan's preference for overwhelming force applied methodically. Joseph Hooker's First Corps took position north of Sharpsburg, preparing to assault the Confederate left flank around the Dunker Church. Edwin Vaugh's Sumner's Second Corps formed the center, while Ambrose Everett Burnside's Ninth Corps positioned itself south of Antietam Creek, tasked with crossing the narrow stone bridge that would later bear his name. Fitz John Porter's Fifth Corps remained in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. As documented in Bruce Catton's Mr. Lincoln's Army, the atmosphere in both camps was tense with anticipation. Veterans on both sides recognized that this battle would be different from previous engagements. The stakes were higher, the forces larger, and the potential consequences more far-reaching than any previous Civil War battle. September 16th passed with sporadic skirmishing. As both armies completed their deployments, Confederate sharpshooters harassed Union reconnaissance efforts while artillery batteries on both sides exchanged occasional salvos across Antietam Creek. Lee received welcome news that Jackson had successfully captured Harper's Ferry, taking nearly 12,000 Union prisoners and vast quantities of supplies. More importantly, Jackson's men were now marching toward Sharpsburg to rejoin the main army. However, time was running short. McClellan's numerical advantage was overwhelming, and Lee knew that his army could not sustain a prolonged battle without Jackson's reinforcements. The Confederate commander spent the evening of September 16th riding his lines, encouraging his men and making final adjustments to defensive positions. As darkness fell over the Maryland countryside, both armies settled into an uneasy silence. Tomorrow would bring the test that would determine whether Lee's audacious invasion could achieve the decisive victory the Confederacy desperately needed, or if McClellan would finally deliver the crushing blow that might end the rebellion once and for all. The first gray light of September 17th, 1862, revealed the morning mist rising from Antietam Creek like the breath of sleeping giants. Both armies stirred in the pre-dawn darkness, soldiers checking their weapons and writing what many feared might be their final letters home. The Battle of Antietam was about to begin with a violence that would earn it the grim distinction of being the bloodiest single day in American military history. Joseph Hooker's First Corps launched the opening assault at dawn, advancing south. From the northwoods toward the Dunker Church, the attack focused on the Hagerstown Pike, where Stonewall Jackson's men, having arrived during the night from Harper's Ferry, had hastily taken defensive positions. The morning air erupted with the thunder of artillery as Union batteries opened fire, their shells screaming overhead to crash into Confederate lines. The cornfield belonging to Farmer David Miller became the epicenter of the morning's slaughter. The corn stood tall and thick, providing concealment for both armies as they struggled for control of this seemingly innocent piece of farmland. Confederate soldiers under Alexander Robert Lawton and John Bell Hood fought desperately to hold their positions as wave after wave of Union infantry crashed against their lines. Hood's Texas Brigade, already legendary for its fighting prowess, found itself in the thick of the carnage. As the Texans advanced through the corn, they collided with Iron Brigade troops from Wisconsin and Indiana in a savage melee that left the field carpeted with casualties. The corn stalks, heavy with September grain, fell like wheat before a scythe as bullets and artillery shells swept across Miller's farm. George Gordon Meade's Pennsylvania reserves joined the assault, pushing through the east woods to strike the Confederate left flank. The fighting seesawed back and forth as neither side could maintain a decisive advantage. Confederate artillery under Jeb Stuart provided crucial support, but the sheer weight of Union numbers began to tell as fresh regiments replaced exhausted ones. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Hooker's corps had suffered devastating casualties. The general himself fell wounded by a Confederate sharpshooter, leaving his command in confusion at the critical moment when breakthrough seemed possible. Joseph King Fenno Mansfield's 12th Corps moved forward to continue the assault, but the 60-year-old general was mortally wounded early in the attack, further disrupting Union coordination. According to Stephen Sears' definitive account, landscape turned red. The morning phase of the battle demonstrated both the courage of the common soldier and the deadly cost of frontal assaults against prepared positions. Confederate defenders, though heavily outnumbered, fought with the desperate intensity of men defending their homeland's invasion. Stonewall Jackson's arrival with his battle-hardened veterans proved crucial in stemming the Union advance. His men, exhausted from their rapid march from Harper's Ferry, nonetheless threw themselves into the battle with characteristic ferocity. The famous Stonewall Brigade, commanded by Andrew Jackson Grigsby after its original officers had fallen in previous battles, held the center of the Confederate line against overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, both sides fed more troops into the meat grinder around the Dunker Church. The small, whitewashed building became a landmark visible through the battle smoke, serving as a reference point for advancing and retreating units alike. Bodies piled up in the cornfield and around the church as the battle's fury reached its peak. Robert Edward Lee, observing the battle from his headquarters near Sharpsburg, realized that his gamble was reaching its climax. The morning assault had been contained, but barely, and his army was being bled white in the process. As the morning carnage around the Dunker Church reached its crescendo, Edwin Vaugh's Sumner's Second Corps prepared to deliver what McClellan hoped would be the decisive blow. The 65-year-old Sumner, nicknamed Bullhead for his aggressive nature and booming voice, led his men across Antietam Creek with the confidence of a veteran who had served in the Army. For decades, however, Sumner's advance would soon encounter one of the most formidable defensive positions on the battlefield. A sunken farm road, worn deep by years of wagon traffic between Sharpsburg and Hagerstown, provided Confederate defenders with a natural trench system. Daniel Harvey Hill's division, supported by elements of Longstreet's corps, had transformed this ordinary country lane into a fortress of death. The road ran roughly east to west for nearly half a mile, its banks rising 3 to 4 feet above the surrounding fields. Confederate soldiers crouched in this natural entrenchment, their rifle barrels resting on the worn dirt banks as they waited for the Union assault. Hill's North Carolina and Alabama regiments, joined by George Burgoyne Anderson's brigade, created overlapping fields of fire that would turn the approaching fields into a killing ground. Israel Richardson's division spearheaded Sumner's assault, advancing across the open farmland toward the concealed Confederate position. The 81st Pennsylvania, 1st Delaware, and other veteran regiments moved forward in parade ground formation, their battle flags snapping in the morning breeze. They had no idea of the horror that awaited them in what would soon be christened Bloody Lane. The first Union assault was a disaster. As Richardson's men crested the small ridge overlooking the sunken road, Confederate rifles erupted in a devastating volley that dropped soldiers like grain before a scythe. The survivors pressed forward only to meet another crushing volley from the second rank of defenders. Within minutes, the field was carpeted with blue-clad bodies as the Union advance disintegrated. Thomas Francis Marr's Irish Brigade, recognizable by their distinctive green flags bearing golden harps, made the next attempt. These Irish immigrants, fighting to prove their loyalty to their adopted homeland, advanced with remarkable courage despite the carnage before them. Their battle cry of Faugh Ballig, clear the way, echoed across the battlefield as they charged toward the Confederate positions. According to Bruce Catton's account in the Army of the Potomac, the Irish Brigade's assault was perhaps the most heroic and tragic episode of the entire battle. Marr's men advanced to within 30 yards of the Confederate line, before withering fire forced them back, leaving over 100 casualties in their wake. The 69th New York alone lost more than half its strength in the failed assault. The pattern repeated throughout the morning as regiment after regiment hurled itself against Hill's impregnable position. Confederate defenders, protected by the sunken road's banks, methodically slaughtered each attacking wave while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The ground in front of the lane became so thick with Union dead that later attackers had to climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades. However, the tide began to turn when a critical tactical error doomed the Confederate defense. During the height of the battle, a confused order caused several Confederate regiments to withdraw from their positions. In the sunken road, Union forces, led by the 5th New Hampshire and 81st Pennsylvania, finally gained a foothold in the lane itself. Once inside the Confederate position, Union soldiers could fire down the length of the sunken road, turning the defenders' advantage against them. What had been a fortress became a trap as Confederate soldiers found themselves caught in an enclosed space with no escape route. The slaughter was horrific, with bodies piling 3 and 4 deep in the narrow lane, while the carnage continued. At Bloody Lane, the focus of the battle was shifting to the southern end of the battlefield, where Ambrose Everett Burnside's 9th Corps faced perhaps the most challenging tactical problem of the entire engagement. The stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek, though only 12 feet wide and 125 feet long, had become the focal point of McClellan's plan to crush Lee's right flank. The bridge, built of local limestone in 1836, was a masterpiece of engineering that had served the community peacefully for over 2 decades. Now it would become a monument to military miscalculation and heroic sacrifice. Confederate forces under Robert Augustus Toombs, the former Georgia senator turned brigadier general, had positioned themselves on the high bluffs overlooking the creek, creating an almost impregnable defensive position. Toombs commanded only about 400 men from his Georgia brigade, but their position was nearly unassailable. The bridge's narrow width meant that Union forces could only attack in column formation, presenting themselves as perfect targets for Confederate marksmen. Positioned among the rocks and trees on the opposite bank, every attempt to cross would be met with devastating flanking fire from multiple directions. Burnside's first assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning. Led by the 11th Connecticut Infantry, Colonel Henry Walter Kingsbury's men advanced courageously toward the bridge, but Confederate rifle fire from the heights above cut them down mercilessly. The narrow stone structure became a funnel of death as blue-clad soldiers fell into the creek below or collapsed on the bridge itself, their bodies creating obstacles for subsequent attacks. The 2nd Maryland and 6th New Hampshire made the next attempt, but with equally disastrous results. As documented in Antony Beevor's historical analysis, the tactical situation at the bridge demonstrated the deadly evolution of military technology. During the Civil War era, rifled muskets in the hands of well-positioned defenders could dominate attacking forces in ways that had been impossible during previous conflicts. Hour after hour, Burnside fed regiment after regiment into the slaughter at the bridge. The 45th Pennsylvania, 21st Massachusetts, and other veteran units suffered horrific casualties in their futile attempts to cross the narrow span. Confederate defenders, though vastly outnumbered, held their positions with grim determination, knowing that their sacrifice was buying precious time for Lee's battered army. The breakthrough finally came at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania simultaneously stormed the bridge. From different angles, the 51st Pennsylvania, led by Colonel John Fraser Hartranft, managed to establish a foothold on the western end of the bridge while the New Yorkers provided covering fire. This coordinated assault overwhelmed Toombs' defenders, who had been fighting continuously for over 3 hours. Once across the bridge, Union forces quickly established a bridgehead on the western bank of Antietam Creek. Burnside's entire corps began pouring across the stone span, finally bringing their overwhelming numerical advantage to bear against the Confederate right flank. Toombs' Georgians, their ammunition nearly exhausted and their casualties mounting, began a fighting withdrawal toward Sharpsburg. However, Burnside's success came at a terrible cost in both time and casualties. The delay at the bridge had allowed Lee precious hours to reorganize his battered forces and call up reserves. What should have been a coordinated assault with the attacks on the Confederate left and center had become a piecemeal affair, allowing Lee to shift troops from quiet sectors to meet each threat as it developed. The stone bridge, forever after known as Burnside's Bridge, had become a symbol of both heroic sacrifice and tactical failure. The structure itself bore the scars of battle, its limestone blocks chipped by rifle bullets and artillery fragments. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon of September 17, 1862, Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia teetered on the brink of complete destruction. Burnside's 9th Corps had finally crossed Antietam Creek and was advancing steadily toward Sharpsburg, threatening to cut off the Confederate Army's only line of retreat across the Potomac River. The situation was so desperate that Lee had committed his last reserves, including his headquarters guard, to stem the Union advance. Burnside's men, their blood up after the costly victory at the Stone Bridge, pressed forward with renewed determination. The 9th New Hampshire, 21st Massachusetts, and other veteran regiments advanced across the rolling farmland south of Sharpsburg, driving Confederate skirmishers before them. For the first time since the battle began, Union forces appeared to have achieved a breakthrough that could end the war. Confederate resistance was crumbling along the entire line. David Rumph Jones' division, defending the approaches to Sharpsburg, was badly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The streets of the small Maryland town filled with wounded soldiers and civilian refugees as the sound of Union battle cries grew ever closer. Lee himself rode among his men, his calm presence providing the only stability in an increasingly chaotic situation. At this critical moment, when Confederate defeat seemed inevitable, fate intervened in the form of Ambrose Powell Hill's Light Division. Hill's men had been left at Harper's Ferry to complete the surrender arrangements and destroy captured Union supplies, but their commander had received urgent orders to march immediately to Sharpsburg. What followed was one of the most dramatic forced marches in military history. Hill drove his men mercilessly across the 17 miles separating Harper's Ferry from the battlefield. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion along the roadside, but the core of the division maintained its cohesion through sheer force of will. Hill himself, dressed in his distinctive red battle shirt and riding among his men to encourage them, pushed the march at a pace that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. As Hill's lead elements approached Sharpsburg, from the south, they could see the dust clouds raised by Burnside's advancing corps. There was no time for reconnaissance or careful deployment. Hill's men went straight from the march into battle formation, deploying across the Confederate right flank. Just as Union forces reached the outskirts of the town, the collision between Hill's fresh troops and Burnside's exhausted corps was explosive. The 16th Connecticut, which had been leading the Union advance, suddenly found itself under attack by Hill's veteran North Carolina and Virginia regiments. The Connecticut men, already weakened by their costly crossing of the bridge and subsequent advance, broke under the unexpected assault. According to James McPherson's analysis in Battle Cry of Freedom, Hill's timely rival represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in Civil War history. Within minutes, what had appeared to be inevitable Confederate defeat was transformed into a successful counterattack that saved Lee's army from destruction. Hill's counterattack spread panic throughout Burnside's corps. Regiments that had fought heroically all day suddenly found themselves facing fresh Confederate troops, attacking from an unexpected direction. The 9th Corps, which had come so close to winning the battle single-handedly, began a hasty withdrawal toward the Stone Bridge that had cost them so dearly to capture. The psychological impact of Hill's arrival extended far beyond its tactical significance. Lee's army, which had been on the verge of collapse just hours earlier, was suddenly infused with new confidence. Confederate soldiers, who had been preparing to retreat across the Potomac River, instead began planning for continued resistance. As evening approached, both armies settled into their positions, exhausted by the day's unprecedented carnage, but still ready to continue the fight. As darkness fell over the blood-soaked fields of Sharpsburg on September 17, 1862, both armies lay stunned by the magnitude of destruction they had inflicted upon each other. The Battle of Antietam had earned its place in history as the single bloodiest day of the American Civil War, with combined casualties exceeding 23,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. The statistical toll was staggering. McClellan's Army of the Potomac suffered approximately 12,400 casualties, while Lee's Army of Northern Virginia lost nearly 11,000 men. For perspective, these losses exceeded the total American casualties in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. Entire regiments had been decimated, with some units losing over 60% of their strength in a single day's fighting. Robert Edward Lee faced the most difficult decision of his military career. As he surveyed his shattered army on the evening of September 17th, his invasion of Maryland had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The hoped-for uprising of Confederate sympathizers in Maryland had not materialized. European recognition remained elusive, and his army was too bloodied to continue offensive operations. Most of his subordinate commanders urged immediate retreat across the Potomac River to the safety of Virginia. However, Lee's audacious nature asserted itself even in defeat. Despite his army's condition, he chose to maintain his positions for another day, daring McClellan to renew the attack. This decision reflected both Lee's understanding of his opponent's cautious nature and his own determination to extract maximum psychological value from the battle. By refusing to retreat immediately, Lee demonstrated that his army remained a formidable fighting force. Despite its losses, George Brinton McClellan, meanwhile, struggled with his own strategic calculations. Despite possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and having achieved tactical successes at multiple points along the Confederate line, he had failed to deliver the decisive blow that could have ended the war. His army retained over 60,000 effective soldiers, easily enough to overwhelm Lee's weakened forces, yet McClellan hesitated to order another assault. The reasons for McClellan's failure to pursue his advantage have been debated by historians for over a century and a half. According to Alan Nevin's comprehensive study, The War for the Union, McClellan's overcautious nature, combined with his tendency to overestimate enemy strength, prevented him from exploiting the victory that lay within his grasp. September 18th passed intense standoff, with both armies expecting renewed combat. Confederate soldiers used the respite to care for their wounded and redistribute ammunition, while Union forces consolidated their positions and brought up reserves. Sporadic skirmishing occurred along the lines, but neither commander was willing to risk another major engagement. That evening, Lee finally ordered the retreat his generals had been advocating since the previous night. Under cover of darkness, the Army of Northern Virginia began its withdrawal across the Potomac River at Bottler's Ford. The retreat was conducted with the same skill that had characterized Lee's generalship throughout the campaign, with Confederate rear guards successfully holding off Union pursuit attempts. The strategic consequences of Antietam extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Lee's invasion had been turned back, eliminating the Confederate threat to Washington, D.C. and the northern states. More importantly, the battle provided President Abraham Lincoln with the victory he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, fundamentally transforming the war's purpose from mere preservation of the Union to a moral crusade against slavery. European intervention, which had seemed increasingly likely following Confederate victories earlier that year, became politically impossible after Antietam. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and French Emperor Napoleon III could not justify supporting a slave-holding confederacy that had just suffered a major defeat on Union soil. The Battle of Antietam thus marked the beginning of the end for Confederate hopes of achieving independence through foreign recognition and military victory. While the war would continue for 2.5 more years, Lee's failed invasion of Maryland represented the high watermark of Confederate fortunes. Never again would the Army of Northern Virginia possess the strength and confidence to attempt such an ambitious offensive campaign.